I want to show you a couple of techniques for doing a blurred background, shallow depth of field effect in Photoshop. One of them is sort of a quick and dirty method, which is great in a pinch, and the other one's a little more precise and refined. The problem with blurred backgrounds typically comes when we're trying to separate our subject from the background. We often end up with halos in the regions right around the subject. So if I select the subject here, and then invert my selection. So now I have a selection that's just the background, right? We can see it here, everything except the areas that are masked off in red. But if I were to try and blur this background right now with just a regular Gaussian blur, you can see the problem right away. Let's turn it up to a really high value to exaggerate it. In all of the areas right around the figure, we're getting this blurred halo. And that doesn't look natural at all. Even at lower values, it's still pretty obvious that there's this halo around the edge of our subject there. That's not what we want. So how can we mitigate that halo? Well, there are a couple of ways to do it. The quick and dirty way would be to select the subject and then invert that selection. I'm using Command-Shift-I on the Mac. It would be Control-Shift-I on a Windows machine. So now I've got that background area selected. I'm going to copy that background to its own layer with a Command or Control-J. And once it's copied to its own layer, and here's the key part, we have to load that layer as a selection so that when we apply our blurring, it doesn't get outside the lines. So I'm going to Command click on that layer thumbnail. That's going to load it as a selection, and I'll do Command or Control H to hide the marching ants so we can really see the impact. Bring up that Gaussian blur filter again, and now, at least at the lower values, we get a relatively clean border around our picture. It's not too bad in terms of haloing. So I can go 20 or 30 pixels here, and I get pretty decent separation between my subject and the background. The only thing I really need to do to make this look a little bit more realistic is to do something about this area where her feet aren't touching the ground. Where we've blurred the floor out, she looks like she's kind of floating there in space. So what we can do to solve that is to add a layer mask to that blurred background layer, and then using the gradient tool to drag in a dark to light gradient up from the bottom of the picture, and that'll reveal a little bit of that original underlying layer that has some of the original depth of field. So that's pretty natural looking, and it works relatively well in a pinch. But if you look closely, you'll actually see a couple of areas where it didn't work perfectly. And if we had turned up the blurring effect a lot more, it would have been fairly obvious. So let's go ahead and mask this off again. I'm going to select the subject. I'm going to invert my selection and copy it to a new layer, load that layer as a selection, hide the marching ants, and run the Gaussian blur filter. But this time I'm going to turn the value up really high. And as I turn it up, you can see some problem areas. We're starting to get this halo where we're getting a leak around our image. So what's causing that? Well, it's caused by a slightly imprecise selection. You can see here that we're a little soft at the edges here. We've picked up a little bit of the dancer's shoulder there, and that stuff is getting dragged into our blurred area when we blur it out. So no matter how hard I try, if I get in there at a fairly high value, it's going to be obvious that I have these areas that aren't blending as well. So I'd like to show you a better solution that will prevent these halos from happening and that'll really isolate your subject. So let's get rid of that background layer. I'm going to start by making a duplicate copy of the background. So I now have a second layer. I'll go ahead and did what I did before and select the subject, and then float the subject up as a copy to its own layer. That's a Command-J or a Control-J. So now I've got a copy of the dancer by herself, and then I've got two copies of the original background layer. Let's go ahead and load the dancer as a selection. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to expand that selection by just a little bit. So we'll go to Select, Modify, and Expand. And let's expand it about 10 pixels or so. Now that I've expanded that border around my dancer, I'm going to go ahead and do a content-aware fill and try and just fill in the entire area where her body was in this background layer. Shift F5 is a keyboard shortcut. I'll do a content-aware fill. And it's probably going to look a little strange when it fills in that area, but it really doesn't matter to me too much what's going on in this inside this area, because the layer that I isolated with the subject is going to be in front of that. So now I'm free to take this background layer and to apply, well, as strong a blur as I'd like to. I could go to a very high value. Let's say we go up into 100 pixels of a Gaussian blur. Well, when I turn my layer on back on top of that, there's absolutely nothing going on at the edges here. There's no halos. We have this really clean separation between our figure and our background. And as I did before, I'm likely to come in and add a little bit of a gradient at the bottom here, a layer mask that'll reveal some of the original layer so she doesn't look like she's just sort of standing on air. So that's two ways of doing a blurred background. One kind of quick and dirty, works well in a pinch, but has the potential to leave behind some halos at the edges. And then a second, more refined and precise way of doing it that's really going to make sure that we have no halos and clean separation between our figure and our background. Let's go ahead and do a couple of more examples so you can really get the hang of it. I'll start by duplicating the background layer. I'll then select subject and copy that subject to its own layer. I'll then command or control click on the layer thumbnail for that subject to load it up as a selection. And then I'll turn off the visibility on that selection layer. We'll go back to our background copy layer, and with the selection in place, we'll modify it and expand it by 10 pixels to include a little bit of the neighboring territory around our subject. Now I can do a content-aware fill. And as I mentioned in the previous demonstration, I'm not too overly concerned with what kind of content gets filled into that area, since it'll typically be blocked by your subject in the foreground. As long as there's a decent enough blend at the edges, we should be fine. Now I'll deselect, so I'm not holding any kind of selection at all, and I can now do a Gaussian blur on that background layer. And I can turn this up to an even extremely high value, and we get very clean separation of our subject and our background. There's no haloing going on at the edges at all. Now that's probably a little larger than I personally need it to be for the blur, so I'll dial that back a little bit, maybe there. And now we've been able to blur out that background in a way that doesn't leave us with any halos around our subject. One more example for you. Same thing we did in the last one. We'll duplicate the background layer, and then we'll go make a selection of our subject. And in this case, the automatic select subject has picked up a few extra areas we didn't want over here and over here. It also missed a little bit of her earlobe and earring. Let's try and fix all of those. So I'm going to pick up the lasso tool with the L key, and I'm going to hold the Option or Alt key down, and I'm going to subtract these two areas from the selection I already have. So now we have just the single figure here. I'm then going to go pick up the Quick Select tool, and I'm going to use it to just try and add back in that little bit of the earring and the earlobe that it was missing. And that seems to have done a decent enough job for me. Now I can copy my selection to its own layer. There it is all by itself, isolated. That'll be in front of the blurred background that we make. I'll load that up as a selection by command or control clicking on the layer thumbnail. Then I'll hide that layer and make sure I've got the background copy as my active layer. I'm going to modify and expand that selection by 10 pixels on all sides. Now I'll do a content-aware fill within it. Shift F5 is your shortcut for that. And that's going to do a pretty good job of filling in that area. I have a little bit of a concern by this area right here where this sort of flesh color is touching the edge of it. It's possible when we blur this layer out that it might actually pick up a little of that. So here's what we're going to do in this case. I'm just going to go pick up the rubber stamp tool. I'm going to sample over here. And I'm going to make sure that I add just a little bit of darkening right at that edge. That should be all that I need. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn on the visibility of my subject on top of that. And with that background copy selected, I can now run my Gaussian blur. And sure enough, it did not push out a little bit of flesh color on the edge there. This was shot with a fairly shallow depth of field to begin with, but I'd like to just minimize some of the background distractions in this scene. So a value of maybe 60 or 70 in my blur. And there you have it. There's our before and after. And we have a very clean boundary between our subject and our blurred area. We don't have any of that haloing going on. So that's how you do background blurring without creating halos around your picture. We've got a quick and dirty way to do it, and we have one that's a little bit more refined and precise. If I'm in a hurry, I'm going to use the first one. If I really care about precision and detail, I'll go ahead and use that second one. Thanks for tuning in.